How does a rusted-out 1974 Massey Ferguson combined with no electronics, no GPS, and no software of any kind outperform 4 brand-new John Deere tractors worth a combined $640,000? The answer took a man named Earl Hollister 17 hours to prove, and it starts on a muddy farm road in Cotswold County, England, in August of 2019. But before I tell you about Earl, I need to tell you about the mud. The summer of 2019 in the English Midlands had been strange. June was dry. July was dry. The wheat across Cotswold County stood golden and tall, and every farmer within 40 miles of Stow-on-the-Wold was watching the sky, waiting for the window. Wheat, once it turns, gives you about 10 days. 10 days to cut it, thresh it, bale the straw, and get it under cover before the rain turns your profit into compost. And by the last week of July, 6,000 acres of winter wheat across the rolling hills north of Cheltenham were ready. Then on August the 1st, at 4:17 in the morning, it started raining. Not the light English drizzle that farmers shrug off, the kind that barely darkens the stone walls and evaporates by noon. This was a system that had crossed the Atlantic, picked up moisture over the Irish Sea, and parked itself over Gloucestershire like it had nowhere else to be and nothing else to do. The first drops hit the tin roofs of the equipment barns with a sound like gravel being poured. Within 20 minutes you couldn't see across the farmyards. 42 millimeters fell in the first 12 hours. Another 28 by nightfall. The lanes turned to rivers, brown water running in the tire ruts like veins on a body. The gateways turned to bogs, 6 inches of clay mud that sucked at your boots and held them like it was hungry. And the wheat, all 6,000 acres of it, began to lean. You could almost watch it happening if you stood at the edge of a field. A slow, wet creaking, like a crowd of tired people leaning against each other for support. Now, I need to stop here and explain something. Leaning wheat is not ruined wheat. Not yet. The grain is still good. The straw is still standing mostly. But every hour it stays wet, the kernels absorb moisture, the test weight drops, and the price per ton falls. At 14% moisture, milling wheat was fetching 172 pounds per ton that summer. At 18%, you're looking at animal feed prices, maybe 120. At 22%, you might as well plow it back in. Every day of rain was costing the farmers of Cotswold County somewhere in the range of 15 pounds per acre. Across 6,000 acres, that's 90,000 pounds a day, dissolving into the soil. The rain stopped on August the 4th. The sun came out on the 5th. And by the morning of August the 6th, every farmer in the county was trying to get into their fields at the same time. Here's what nobody at the cooperative yard knew that morning. At 7:15, Graham Whitfield fired up his 2019 John Deere 6250R. This was not a cheap piece of equipment. The 6250R carried a 6-cylinder, 6.8-liter PowerTech engine producing 250 horsepower. It had the Command Pro transmission, the Starfire 6000 GPS receiver, the Generation 4 Command Center display, and, this is what matters, the JD-Link telematics system that connected the tractor to Deere's operations center through a cellular modem built into the cab roof. Graham had financed it for £312,000 over 7 years. It was the most expensive single object he had ever owned, including his house. Graham drove it out of the yard, turned onto the lane, and made it about 400 meters before the command center screen flickered. Went blue, displayed an error code he'd never seen, DTF 4471, and the entire powertrain shut down. Just stopped. 250 horsepower of precision-engineered German diesel, and it sat in the lane like a sleeping horse. He called the dealer in Morton-in-Marsh. They told him to cycle the ignition. He cycled it. Same error. They told him to wait 15 minutes and try again. He waited. Same error. They told him they'd send a technician. I'll get to what DTF 4471 actually meant. First, let me tell you what was happening on the other side of the county. Richard Pemberton had the same tractor, not the same model, the same year, the same spec, the same telematics package. He'd gotten it running at 6:45 that morning, 20 minutes ahead of Graham, and he'd actually made it into a field. He'd cut about 3 acres of wheat. Beautiful, clean cutting, the GPS holding his lines to within 2 centimeters when his screen did the same thing. Blue. DTF 4471. Dead. By 9 o'clock that morning, 4 John Deere tractors across Cotswold County had thrown the same error code within a 2-hour window. 4 machines, 1.2 million pounds of equipment combined. All sitting silent in fields and lanes while 6,000 acres of wet wheat waited. Let me ask you something, and I want you to think about it. Have you ever had your phone update overnight and wake up to find that something you relied on simply doesn't work anymore? Now imagine that phone weighs 11 tons and your entire year's income depends on it working for the next 72 hours. The technician from the dealership arrived at Graham's farm just before noon. His name was Craig, and he was 26 years old, and he had a diagnostic laptop that he plugged into the port behind the command center display. What Craig found was this. At approximately 2 o'clock that morning, Greenwich Mean Time, John Deere's operations center, had pushed a telematics firmware update to all connected machines in the United Kingdom and Ireland. The update was meant to patch a minor security vulnerability in the JD-Link cellular modem. Something about the way the modem hand shook with the new 4G towers that were being rolled out across rural England. It was a routine update. It was supposed to install silently in under 3 minutes while the machines were off. But the update had a bug. Specifically, it contained a certificate mismatch that caused the tractor's integrated control unit, the computer brain that governs everything from the throttle to the hydraulics to the emission system, to interpret the new firmware as unauthorized third-party software. And when a modern John Deere tractor detects unauthorized software, it does exactly what it's designed to do. It shuts everything down: the engine management system, the transmission controller, the hydraulic pump, all locked behind an error code that only a dealer-level diagnostic tool can clear. Before I tell you what happened next, you need to understand something about how a modern tractor actually works compared to an old one, because this is the whole spine of this story. A 2019 John Deere 6250R contains approximately 47 electronic control units, 47 separate computers, all networked together on a CAN bus, controller area network, that runs at 250 kilobits per second. One ECU manages the engine, one manages the transmission, one handles the hydraulics, one monitors the exhaust after-treatment system, the diesel particulate filter, and the selective catalytic reduction system that injects urea into the exhaust to meet Tier 4 emission standards. One manages the GPS, one runs the display, one handles the telematics, and all of them, every single one, must agree with each other before the tractor will start. If one ECU throws a fault that another ECU considers safety critical, the whole system locks. It's called a cascading interlock, and it's designed to prevent a runaway engine or a hydraulic failure at speed. In normal operation, it's a sensible safety feature. But when the telematics ECU, the one that talks to the internet, decides that the engine management ECU is running unauthorized code, the cascading interlock treats it as though the engine itself is compromised, and it kills everything. Now here's the thing. A 1974 Massey Ferguson 510 combine harvester has 0 electronic control units. 0. It has a Perkins A6 354 diesel engine, a 6-cylinder, 5.8-liter naturally aspirated unit that produces 110 horsepower. No turbo, no intercooler, no aftertreatment, no catalytic converter, no diesel particulate filter, no urea injection. The fuel system is a simple Sims inline injection pump with mechanical governors. You push the throttle forward, a cable pulls a lever, more fuel enters the cylinders, the engine speeds up. There is no computer deciding whether you're allowed to do this. There is no cellular modem phoning home to ask permission. There is no software update at 2 in the morning that can decide your harvest is over. The engine connects to the threshing drum through a belt. The belt connects to the sieves through another belt. The unloading auger runs off a gear drive. If something jams, you stop, get out, clear it with your hands, and start again. The combine doesn't know what day it is. It doesn't know what field it's in. It doesn't know its own location to within 2 centimeters. It doesn't care. It cuts wheat. That difference between a machine that requires permission and a machine that simply works is what turned August the 6th into a day that farmers in Cotswold County still talk about. Now let me tell you about Earl Hollister. Earl was 71 years old in August of 2019. He'd farmed 320 acres north of Bourton-on-the-Water since 1972 when he took over from his father, who'd taken over from his father before that. The Hollisters had been on that same ground since 1919, a full century, and in all that time they had never once missed a harvest. Not through drought, not through flood, not through foot and mouth, not through BSE, not through the milk price collapse of 1999 that took out 14 farms in the valley. Earl's secret, if you could call it that, was that he never threw anything away, and he never bought anything on credit. His main harvesting machine was a 1974 Massey Ferguson 510 combine. He'd bought it used in 1983 for £4,200 from a farm sale in North Leach. By 2019, it was 36 years in his possession and 45 years old overall. The paint that had once been Massey Ferguson red had faded to something closer to dried blood. The cab, and I use that word generously, was an aftermarket safety cab that someone had bolted on in the early 80s, with a windscreen that had a crack running from one corner to the other, and a door that had to be tied shut with baler twine. The seat was a metal pan with a piece of carpet offcut taped to it. But here's what you need to know about Earl's combine. Every winter, from November to February, Earl stripped that machine down to its skeleton. He pulled the engine, checked the bearings, replaced the piston rings every 3 years, whether they needed it or not. He sharpened or replaced every cutting blade on the header. He retensioned every belt. He greased every fitting, and there were 114 of them, with a hand pump by feel, until he could tell from the resistance of the grease gun whether a bearing was wearing out. He checked the concave clearances with a feeler gauge, setting them to within 1/4 of a millimeter. That combine was 45 years old, and it ran better than it had the day it left the factory in Coventry, because Earl knew it the way a surgeon knows the human body. There's something I haven't told you yet. Earl wasn't the only one affected by the software failure, but he was the only one who didn't care. By noon on August the 6th, the phone at the Cotswold Farmers Cooperative was ringing off the hook. 4 dear owners were down. 2 of them had crops they could reach but couldn't cut. 2 were stuck in lanes with machines they couldn't even move under their own power. The dealer was saying 48 hours minimum for a patch. The fix had to come from Deere's software team in Kaiserslautern, Germany, be validated, pushed to the UK servers, and then installed machine by machine with a diagnostic laptop. 48 hours. And the Met Office was showing another weather system arriving on August the 9th. 3 days. They had 3 days. Graham Whitfield was standing in the yard of the cooperative at 12:30, covered in mud up to his knees, his cap pushed back on his head, looking at his phone like it had personally betrayed him. Richard Pemberton was there too, and so were Tom Alsop and David Frayne, the other 2 Deere owners who'd been bricked. Between them, they had roughly 2,000 acres of wheat that needed cutting before Saturday. Now, this is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. Earl Hollister pulled into the cooperative yard at 10 minutes to 1, driving his Land Rover Defender, a 1987 model. Naturally, no electronics. and trailing behind it on a low-loader flatbed was the Massey Ferguson 510. He'd brought it down from his farm on a hunch after his neighbor had called to tell him about the software problem. Earl had finished his own 320 acres in late July during the dry window because his combine didn't need GPS guidance to find its lines, and it didn't need a satellite connection to start its engine. He'd been done for a week while everyone else was still waiting for the weather to break. The 510 on the flatbed looked like something out of a museum. Or more accurately, it looked like something a museum would reject as too far gone. The paint was gone in patches. Not peeling, just worn away by decades of wheat stalks brushing against the metalwork like sandpaper, one harvest at a time. The grain tank had a dent on the left side where Earl had backed into a gatepost in 1997. He'd never fixed it. He said it helped him remember which side to watch. The discharge auger had been welded, re-welded, and then welded again, and the welds looked like scar tissue. Raised, rough, functional. He parked in the yard, got out, slowly, the way a 71-year-old gets out of a Land Rover, one hand on the doorframe, both knees cracking, and walked over to the group of younger farmers standing around their phones. "I heard you boys are having computer trouble," he said. Graham Whitfield looked at the Massey Ferguson on the flatbed. The rust, the cracked windscreen, the baler twine holding the door shut. He looked back at Earl. "Earl, that thing's older than I am," Graham said. "So am I," Earl said, "and I'm here, and your tractor isn't working." There was a silence. David Frayne, who was 43 and had the driest sense of humor in the county, looked at the combine and then at Earl and said, "Can it even cut wet wheat?" "It cut wet wheat in 1976, Earl said, "and that was a worse year than this." Here's what nobody at that cooperative yard knew. Earl Hollister hadn't just brought his combine on a whim. He'd spent the morning calculating. His 510 had a 12-foot cutting header, at a forward speed of about 3 miles per hour in heavy, wet wheat. Slow, careful, the way you have to go when the crop is leaning. He could cut roughly 3 acres per hour. In a 17-hour day, starting at 5 in the morning and finishing at 10 at night with the lights on, and the 510 did have lights, 2 halogen floods that Earl had wired in himself. He could do 50 acres. Maybe 55 if the wheat was standing well. 2,000 acres divided by 50 acres per day meant 40 days. He had 3. It was impossible. He knew it was impossible. But here's what Earl also knew. You don't need to save everything. You need to save enough. He looked at the 4 farmers and he said something that Richard Pemberton would repeat in the pub for years afterward. "I can't do all of it, but I can do the best of it. Show me your best fields and I'll cut them first." What Earl was proposing was triage, the same principle a battlefield surgeon uses. You don't try to save everyone. You assess who has the best chance and you put your resources there. The 4 farmers spread a crumpled ordnance survey map across the bonnet of Graham's Land Rover, the hood still warm from the drive over, and started marking fields. Graham had a 60-acre field of Group 1 milling wheat, Skyfall variety, the highest value crop in the rotation. That was on well-drained Cotswold brash over limestone and was still standing reasonably clean. The soil there was thin and rocky, which meant it shed water faster than the heavier clay further north. Richard had a 40-acre field of the same quality on a south-facing slope that had caught every hour of sun since the rain stopped and had dried faster than anything else in the valley. Tom had 30 acres on chalk ground that drained like a sieve. His grandfather had always called it the fast field because nothing stayed wet on it for long. David had a 45-acre block, but only the top 20 acres were worth prioritizing. The bottom half sat in a hollow and was still waterlogged. Those 150 acres represented the cream of the harvest, milling wheat at 172 pounds per ton instead of feed wheat at 120. The difference was roughly 52 pounds per ton, multiplied across those acres at yields of about 3.5 tons per acre. which meant saving those fields first was worth about £27,000 more than saving the same acreage of lower quality crop. Earl didn't do this calculation on the paper. He didn't need to. He'd been making decisions like this his entire life, weighing time against weather, against money, against what the land would give you if you asked it right. They agreed on the order. Graham first, because his field was closest and the access track was hard-packed limestone that wouldn't bog the combine. Then Richard, then Tom, then the top end of David's ground. After that, whatever was left of the daylight and Earl's stamina. Earl started in Graham's field at 2 o'clock that afternoon. I want you to picture this. A combine harvester built in 1974, painted a color that no longer exists in any paint chart, with a cab held together by twine and willpower, creeping across a field of English wheat, while 4 farmers stood at the headland watching in silence. The ground was soft. Not liquid, not impossible, but soft enough that the combine left ruts 3 inches deep, and you could smell the wet clay coming up through the stubble, mixing with the sharp sweetness of cut straw and the diesel smoke that poured from the exhaust stack in a blue-gray ribbon that hung in the humid air and refused to disperse. The sound of it was nothing like a modern combine. A modern machine hums, it purrs. The cab is sealed and pressurized, and the engine is buried under sound-deadening panels, and from 50 meters away you could mistake it for a large appliance. The Massey Ferguson 510 roared. The Perkins diesel had no muffler left to speak of. Earl had replaced it twice and given up the third time because the vibration kept cracking the mounting brackets, and it bellowed across the valley with a sound like some enormous animal clearing its throat. Every exhaust stroke sent a pulse through the air that you could feel against your face. The threshing drum, spinning at 1,050 RPM, produced a deep, rhythmic beating that you could feel in your chest from 30 meters away, a heartbeat for a creature made of iron and belt rubber and 45 years of stubborn continuity. And the wheat, wet and heavy and leaning at 30 degrees from vertical, fed into the header with a sound like tearing cloth. A continuous, ragged whisper that told you the crop was coming in. Earl drove with both hands on the wheel and his eyes on the crop, not on a screen. He watched the way the straw fed in. He listened to the engine when the drum slowed, and you could hear it, a slight drop in pitch. He knew the concave was loading up, and he'd ease back the forward speed with his left hand on the ground speed lever until the drum came back up. No algorithm, no sensor array. Just a man who'd been listening to that engine for 36 years and could hear a quarter-turn change in RPM the way a musician hears a note go flat. He didn't stop for dinner. Graham's wife, Helen, brought him a flask of tea and a ham sandwich at 6 o'clock, and he ate it while turning on the headland, steering with his knees, the sandwich in one hand, and the flask wedged between his thigh and the armrest of the seat, which was a metal pan with a piece of carpet off-cut taped to it. The tea was strong enough to stand a spoon in, the way farm tea always is, and it tasted like everything good about England. Warm, bitter, honest. By 8 o'clock, the light was going. The sun dropped behind the ridge to the west, and the field turned grey, then blue, then dark. Earl reached up to the switch panel he'd wired in himself, 2 toggle switches from a marine supply catalogue mounted on an aluminium plate bolted to the cab frame, and flipped on the halogen floods. 2 500-watt lamps mounted on the cab roof threw hard white light across the header and 30 meters of wheat ahead, turning the combine into a kind of lighthouse moving across a golden sea. Moths came from nowhere, hundreds of them spiraling in the light beams like snow. The wheat in the lights looked almost white. He kept cutting. The engine temperature held steady at 82 degrees Celsius. The oil pressure sat at 45 psi. He checked these gauges every few minutes. Real gauges, with needles and glass faces, not pixels on a screen. And they told him what he needed to know. The machine was happy. The machine was working. By 10:15 that night, with the halogen floods cutting white tunnels through the August dark, and the stars coming out above him in a sky that smelled of cut straw and diesel, he'd finished Graham's 60 acres. The grain was at 17.2% moisture, not perfect, but well within the range that could be dried down to milling spec at the cooperative's grain dryer for about £4 per ton. He drove the combine out of the field, parked it in the gateway with the header resting on the ground, climbed into his Land Rover, and slept for 4 hours with his cap over his face and his boots still on. He started Richard's field at 5 the next morning. The dew was heavy, the wheat was wet again from overnight condensation, and he had to wait until 6:30 before the moisture was down enough to thresh cleanly. He sat on the bonnet of the Defender with another flask of tea, watching the mist lift off the valley, listening to the wood pigeons calling in the oak trees along the field boundary. At 6:32, he climbed back into the cab, turned the key, and the Perkins coughed twice and settled into its familiar rumbling idle. He engaged the header, he engaged the drum, and he went back to work. Now I need to take you back inside the John Deere dealership, because what was happening there is the other half of this story. Craig, the technician, had been on the phone with Deere's UK support centre in Langar, Nottinghamshire, since the previous afternoon. Langar had escalated to Mannheim. Mannheim had escalated to Kaiserslautern. The software team in Kaiserslautern had identified the certificate mismatch within hours. It was, by all accounts, a single mismatched hash value in the firmware signing chain, a string of 64 characters where one character was wrong. One character. But fixing it required regenerating the certificate, recompiling the firmware, running it through the validation suite, pushing it to the European distribution server, and then deploying it through the dealer's Service Advisor diagnostic tool, one machine at a time. The patch arrived at the Morton and Marsh dealership at 11 o'clock on the morning of August the 8th. Craig drove to Graham's farm first. It took 45 minutes to flash the new firmware, clear the error code, and verify that all 47 ECUs were talking to each other again. 45 minutes of a technician's time, £130 call-out fee, and a machine that should never have stopped in the first place. By the time Graham's Deere was running again, Earl had been cutting for 44 hours across 2.5 days. He'd done Graham's 60 acres, Richard's 40 acres, Tom's 30 acres on the chalk ground, and he was 18 acres into David Frain's best field. 148 acres in total, 3 acres per hour, hour after hour, with 2 breaks for sleep of about 4 hours each in the cab of his Land Rover. He didn't know it yet, but what he'd done had saved those 4 farmers roughly £68,000 in crop value. 148 acres of milling wheat at 3.5 tons per acre and a £52 per ton premium over feed wheat. £68,000 harvested by a machine that had cost £4,200 in 1983. Years later, Graham Whitfield would say that August of 2019 was the moment he stopped trusting any machine he couldn't fix with a spanner. There's something else that happened that week that matters more than the money. On the evening of August the 7th, while Earl was cutting Richard's field, Graham drove out to the headland and stood watching. He'd brought 2 bottles of ale from the Hook Norton Brewery and a folding chair. He sat there for an hour, just watching the old combine work. When Earl came around on the headland, Graham waved him down. "Earl," he said, "I owe you more than I can pay you." Earl shut off the header but left the engine running. The diesel settled into a low, rattling idle that shook the whole cab. "You don't owe me anything," Earl said. "Your father helped my father with his lambing in '78 when I had pneumonia. This is how it works." Graham looked at the combine. He looked at the cracked windscreen and the baler twine and the carpet on the seat. "I've been thinking," he said. "My boy wants to farm. He's 19. He's good with computers, but he's never turned a spanner in his life. Could he come up to your place this winter? Just to learn how things work?" Earl thought about that for a moment. Then he said, "Send him up in November. I'll be pulling the engine." That small detail would matter more than anyone imagined. Graham's son, James Whitfield, spent the winter of 2019 to 2020 in Earl Hollister's workshop. He learned how to set valve clearances on a Perkins diesel. He learned how to read a micrometer. He learned how to tell a good bearing from a dying one by rolling it between his fingers and feeling for the roughness. He learned how to sharpen a cutting blade on a bench grinder until you could shave with it. He learned the names of things: gudgeon pin, conrod, big end shell, injector nozzle, timing chain tensioner. That his generation had never needed to know because their machines were black boxes that only the dealer could open. And he learned something else, something that Earl never said out loud but that James understood by February. A machine you can fix yourself is a machine that cannot be taken from you. A machine that needs permission from a server in Germany to start its engine does not belong to you in any way that matters, no matter what the finance documents say. Let me pause here and ask you something. What's worth more? A tool that does everything, or a tool that always works? In March of 2020, the world locked down. Supply chains broke. Dealer service appointments were cancelled. Parts deliveries were delayed by weeks, and the farmers who had machines they could maintain themselves, the old iron, the mechanical diesels, the analog hydraulics, kept working. The ones who needed a technician with a laptop to clear a fault code waited. Earl Hollister harvested his 100th consecutive crop in 2019, counting from the year his grandfather started on that ground. The Massey Ferguson 510 was the machine that did it. It's still on his farm. He still uses it. Every winter, he still strips it down, and now James Whitfield comes up to help him, bringing his own tools and his own overalls and a knowledge of mechanical things that he carries in his hands, in a way that no software update can erase. The right to repair movement, which had been simmering in America and Europe for years before 2019, found some of its loudest and most articulate voices in English farming communities after that summer. Farmers who had never thought much about software licensing or end-user agreements or digital rights management suddenly had strong opinions about all three, because they'd watched their livelihood sit motionless in fields, while a corporation on another continent decided when and how to fix a problem that the corporation itself had caused. The question the movement asks is simple but fundamental. If you buy a machine, do you own it? Or do you lease the right to operate it at the pleasure of the manufacturer? When John Deere can push a software update at 2 in the morning that bricks your tractor during harvest week, who actually controls your livelihood? When the diagnostic tools are locked behind dealer licensing agreements and the repair manuals are classified as proprietary intellectual property, what does ownership even mean? The answer, as Earl Hollister demonstrated on a muddy August afternoon with a machine that predated the personal computer, is that the person who controls the wrench controls the machine. Everything else is a permission slip. Graham Whitfield still has his John Deere 6250R. He still uses it. But he also bought, in the autumn of 2019, a 1982 Massey Ferguson 590 tractor. No electronics, mechanical injection pump, 4-cylinder Perkins, for £3,800 at a farm dispersal sale in Winchcombe. He keeps it in the barn, serviced and ready, the way some people keep a generator for when the power goes out. His insurance policy against the next time the internet decides his harvest is over. Richard Pemberton did something different. He kept his Deere, but he had Craig, the technician, show him how to access the Service Advisor software himself. He bought a used dealer diagnostic laptop on an online auction site for £700 and taught himself to read fault codes and clear them. The dealer wasn't happy about it. Deere's licensing terms specifically prohibited unauthorized access to the Service Advisor platform. Richard didn't care. "It's my tractor," he said. And that was the end of the discussion. David Frayne, the driest man in the county, summed up the whole episode in 6 words that became something of a local proverb. Someone asked him at the harvest supper what he'd learned that August, and he took a sip of his cider and said, "Old iron don't need Wi-Fi." That line got printed on T-shirts. It showed up on bumper stickers on Land Rovers across the Cotswolds. It was quoted in a Guardian article about the right to repair movement in December of 2019. It became, in its small way, a rallying cry for a community that had learned the hard way what happens when you hand the keys to your livelihood to a software engineer in another country. In November of 2023, the European Union adopted new right-to-repair rules that, among other things, required manufacturers of agricultural equipment to provide independent access to diagnostic tools and software. The legislation cited, among its justifications, the economic vulnerability created by manufacturer-controlled telematics systems. It didn't mention Cotswold County or Earl Hollister or a rusted Massey Ferguson 510, but the principle was the same. If you own it, you should be able to fix it, and if you can't fix it, you don't really own it. Earl Hollister turned 76 in January of 2024. He's still farming. The 320 acres are still in wheat and barley and oilseed rape, rotating the way his grandfather taught his father and his father taught him. The Massey Ferguson 510 is now 50 years old. The Perkins engine has been rebuilt 4 times. The header has been re-welded so many times that Earl jokes there's more of his steel in it than Massey Ferguson's. The cab still has the cracked windscreen. The door is still tied shut with baler twine. And every August, when the wheat turns golden on the hills above Bourton-on-the-Water, that old combine comes out of the barn, coughs to life with a sound like a bear waking from hibernation, and does what it was built to do. No updates required. James Whitfield is 24 now. He farms alongside his father on the family's 600 acres, and he keeps that 1982 Ferguson 590 in the barn like a family heirloom, the oil fresh, the battery on a trickle charger, ready to work at 15 minutes' notice. But he also does something Earl never did and never would have thought to do. He films his winter rebuild sessions, the engine teardowns, the bearing inspections, the valve lapping, the blade sharpening on the old pedestal grinder in Earl's workshop, and posts them online, where they've found an audience of tens of thousands of young farmers across England, Scotland, Ireland, and far beyond, who are hungry to learn the mechanical skills that their fathers never taught them because the dealers said they wouldn't need them, because the brochures said the future was digital, because the salesman said you'd never have to open the bonnet again. The comment sections under James's videos are full of the same question, asked 100 different ways by people in 100 different places, from Devon to Denmark to Des Moines. How do I learn to fix my own equipment? Where do I start? What tools do I need? Is it too late? And James always gives the same answer, the one Earl gave him on his first day in the workshop in November of 2019, standing over a Perkins diesel with a 1/4-inch ring spanner in his hand. Start by taking something apart, then put it back together. Then do it again until your hands remember. The combine sits in the barn right now, waiting for August. The oil has been changed, the belts have been tensioned, the blades are sharp. It doesn't know what year it is. It doesn't know that the world has changed around it, that tractors now drive themselves, and combines now map their own yields to the square meter, and grain carts now talk to accounting software in real time. It doesn't know any of that, and it doesn't need to. It just needs a key, a throttle, and someone who knows how to listen. Stories like this don't get told enough. If this channel matters to you, leave a comment and tell me, what's the oldest tool you still rely on, and why do you trust it more than anything new?